October 14, 1958. 14:27 hours. A radar station perched on permafrost, 300 miles south of the Arctic Circle. The wind doesn't howl here, it presses, a constant low force against the aluminum skin of the building as if the cold itself is leaning in to listen. Inside the operations room, fluorescent lights hum faintly. The air smells of ozone, instant coffee, and wool that never quite dries. A single man sits at the console. His name is Airman First Class Robert Hale, United States Air Force, 23 years old, 6 months into a solo rotation at a distant early warning line station so remote that supply planes land only when weather permits and voices from home arrive weeks late, flattened by static. The radar scope glows green. A slow, sweeping arm rotates clockwise again and again, erasing and redrawing the same emptiness. Hale's gloved hand rests near the plotting board, not tense, not relaxed, simply ready. He has been here since dawn. No alarms. No incoming signals. No one to talk to. Outside, the sun hangs low, never fully rising, never fully setting. Time stretches in odd directions at this latitude. Minutes feel heavy, hours dissolve. Hale leans back slightly in his chair. The metal creaks. He exhales, fogging the air for a moment before the heater swallows it. And then, without warning, without drama, something inside him stops. Not his thoughts. The way they arrange themselves. Until this afternoon, his inner world has followed a familiar pattern. Every observation arrives already shaped, already prepared, phrased as if someone else might be listening. If the generator stutters, a sentence forms, I should report this. If boredom creeps in, I shouldn't feel this way. If fear flickers, I'd never admit that out loud. Even alone, his mind has behaved like a briefing room. An invisible audience. An imagined evaluation. A constant rehearsal. But now, as the radar sweeps and the wind presses and the minutes pile up, there is a small, almost imperceptible release. A thought arises. And for the first time, it does not reach outward. It does not explain itself. It does not justify its presence. It does not prepare for misunderstanding. It simply exists. Hale blinks, he shifts in his chair, unsettled, though nothing has changed in the room. The lights hum, the scope sweeps, his breath moves in and out. Yet the silence feels different. Not emptier. He realizes he has been staring at the screen without narrating it. No internal commentary, no quiet performance, just green light moving across glass. The absence is subtle enough that he almost misses it. Almost. You can imagine the sensation if you've ever caught yourself mid-thought and realized you weren't talking to anyone inside your own head. No inner witness, no future explanation forming, just awareness unaccompanied. Hale rubs his hands together more out of habit than cold. His logbook lies open beside him, the pen rests where he left it. For several minutes he doesn't reach for it. That too is new. The military trains men to report, to account, to narrate reality upward through chains of command. Even here at the edge of the continent, procedure fills the silence. Logs are meticulous, language is constant. But something about this afternoon resists documentation. When Hale finally does pick up the pen, he pauses. The words don't arrive the way they usually do. There is no internal voice lining them up in advance. He writes anyway. 1,400, 1,500 hours, routine sweep, no contacts. The sentence feels strangely final, complete, as if it does not require interpretation. He sets the pen down. A faint unease settles in his chest, not fear exactly, but disorientation, as though a familiar background noise has shut off and left his ears ringing. Where did it go? The commentary. The inner rehearsal. The part of him that used to lean forward, anticipating response. He listens for it. It doesn't return. Outside, the Arctic afternoon drifts on, indifferent. The station stands isolated against miles of white and gray. No one knows what is happening inside this young airman, not because it's secret, but because there is suddenly nothing to explain. And that, quietly, is the most unsettling realization of all. Because once the mind stops preparing to be understood, what exactly remains? The generator coughs once, metal on metal. then settles back into its steady rhythm. Hale notices it, but he doesn't comment on it, not even internally. That's when the unease sharpens. Because noticing used to trigger something else, a reflex, a quiet line of thought shaped like a report, a judgment, or a correction. If this fails, I'll need to explain why. If someone asks later, I should remember this moment. Now there is only the sound. The fact of it. Nothing reaching forward, nothing reaching back. He shifts his weight and feels the chair beneath him, its cold metal legs, the thin padding worn smooth by other men who once sat here thinking their own rehearsed thoughts. The room feels flatter somehow, less layered, as if depth has been replaced by presence. Time passes. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just evenly. This is not how his mind usually experiences hours alone. In the early months of his posting, solitude had been loud, memories replayed themselves with added dialogue, imagined conversations ran on loops, arguments were refined, letters were silently rewritten before they were ever sent. Isolation had amplified the inner voice. But prolonged silence does something else. At first it starves the voice of new material, then, gradually, it starves it of purpose. Hale remembers the first weeks at the station. How he would narrate even the smallest actions, coffee, ready, another sweep complete, I'll check the panel again, as if someone were standing just behind him, evaluating his competence. That presence had felt so normal he never questioned it. Until now. He stands and walks to the narrow window at the far end of the room. Outside, the tundra stretches unbroken. Snow drifts catch the weak light like ash frozen mid-fall. There is no movement, no horizon that invites interpretation. The world does not seem to require a response. For a moment, Hale waits for the familiar inner tightening, the sense that he should feel something about this view. Awe, loneliness, insignificance. Words he's heard before, words that would make sense if spoken aloud. They don't come. Instead, there is a strange solidity, a quiet pressure behind the eyes, not emotional, not numb, simply unadorned. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment something important withdraws, not into darkness but inward. The psychic energy once spent anticipating recognition begins to fold back on itself. The mind stops projecting a listener where none exists. The imagined audience dissolves. And with it, the performance. Hale doesn't think this in words. The realization arrives more like a physical adjustment, like stepping off a moving walkway and feeling your balance reset. He returns to the console, sits, watches the sweep. A question tries to form. Is this good or bad? It doesn't finish. Evaluation itself seems unnecessary. Hours later, when the relief shift finally arrives, boots crunching, a voice breaking the air, Hale feels a faint jolt, like a system restarting after a long pause. Quiet day, the other airman asks, shrugging off his parka. Hale opens his mouth. And stops. For a split second he can't find the angle, not the words, those are easy, but the reason, the subtle urge to frame the experience so it lands correctly in someone else's mind. He answers anyway, yeah, quiet. The word feels heavier than usual, complete. As he gathers his things, he notices something else, a slight resistance to conversation. Not irritation, not withdrawal, just an absence of urgency. He doesn't need to be mirrored. That night in his bunk, the old habits try to return. The mind reaches for narrative, for explanation, for meaning that can be shared later. But the machinery doesn't engage the way it used to. Thoughts arise and fall away, without arranging themselves into speeches. No inner listener interrupts. Sleep comes faster. Over the following days, Hale becomes aware that this change is not fleeting. It does not spike and fade like a mood, it settles. He still thinks, still plans, still remembers. But the tone has changed. The internal voice, once angled outward, now speaks only when needed. There is less commentary, less self-correction, less imagined judgment hovering over even the smallest actions. He doesn't feel wiser. He feels finished. Not complete in a triumphant sense, finished as in no longer mid-sentence. And that is what unsettles him most. Because so much of who he thought he was had been shaped in anticipation of response, of understanding, of being received. Without that anticipation, something else stands alone. Something quieter. Something firmer. Something that does not ask. He wonders briefly whether this is what maturity feels like when it arrives without ceremony. Not growth but consolidation, not expansion but grounding. The thought drifts away before it can turn into a theory. The station continues its watch. The Cold War continues its silent tension far beyond the horizon. Somewhere, men in offices debate threats and signals and futures. Here in the Arctic stillness, a different shift has already occurred. One that won't appear in any report. And as Hale closes his eyes, a final, unsettling question brushes the edge of awareness. If the mind no longer prepares to be understood, who exactly has it been answering to all along? The next afternoon arrives without announcement. No shift in light, no clear boundary, just the same pale glow pressing against the station windows, the same wind tracing its fingers along the walls. Hale is back at the console, hands steady, posture unchanged. But the inner climate is different. What surprises him now is not the silence, it's the weight of it. Not heaviness. Density. Each moment feels more contained, as if experience no longer spills forward into explanation. When he checks the instruments, he checks them. When he drinks coffee, he tastes it. When a memory surfaces, it doesn't expand into commentary, it simply appears, then settles. There is less motion inside. And paradoxically, more presence. He notices how often in the past his thoughts leaned toward an imagined future, someone he might one day tell this to, some version of himself who would later interpret it. That orientation had shaped everything. Even solitude had been provisional, temporary, waiting. Now waiting itself feels obsolete. From a Jungian perspective, this is the psyche pulling energy back from the persona, not the social mask itself, but the anticipation of wearing it. The mind no longer rehearses its justifications for being. It no longer arranges its experiences for approval. The result is not emptiness. It is gravity. Hale feels it when he stands, when he moves, when he listens to the faint tick of cooling metal in the walls. His actions no longer echo, they land. At first, this gravity is disorienting. There is a faint sense of having arrived somewhere without a map. He realizes how much of his identity had been buoyed by reflection, by seeing himself reflected, even in imagination. Without reflection, there is no distortion. Only outline. He begins to understand why the logs from other DW line stations sometimes include odd, non-technical notes, phrases like "time felt complete today," or "nothing to add." At the time, these entries were dismissed as fatigue or monotony. Now they read differently. They read like men running out of unnecessary words. During his off hours, Hale sits in the common room and stares at the radio set. He doesn't turn it on. Static would feel intrusive. He thinks of home, of conversations that once felt urgent, necessary, defining. They no longer pull at him the same way. Not because he doesn't care. Because caring no longer requires articulation. This is the quiet danger and the quiet gift of prolonged solitude. It doesn't just remove voices from the environment, it removes the need for them inside. And when that need dissolves, something fundamental is exposed. A self that does not negotiate its existence. A self that does not perform continuity. A self that does not rush to be seen. Hale senses dimly that this shift may not be reversible. That when he eventually returns south, back to noise, back to faces, back to mirrors, something will resist reassembly. The old reflexes may return, the explanations, the rehearsals. But they will feel optional. That thought lingers longer than the others. Because if identity no longer depends on being understood, then misunderstanding loses its power. The realization is not comforting. It is sobering. As the afternoon settles into its endless Arctic plateau, Hale looks once more at the radar screen, still empty, still sweeping. The world waits for threats. But inside him, a different vigilance has ended. Not with relief. With finality. A week later, something small happens. So small it almost escapes notice. Hale is mid-shift when the radar briefly flickers, just a momentary distortion, a ghosting of light that shouldn't be there. His training responds instantly. Hands move, eyes narrow. He checks the calibration, confirms the sweep, logs the anomaly. Textbook procedure. But what doesn't happen is more telling. There is no spike of inner narration. No surge of imagined scrutiny. No anticipatory defense forming in case someone questions his response later. The action stands on its own. In earlier months, moments like this would echo. He would replay them mentally, refining explanations, anticipating judgment. Rehearsing how to sound competent if asked. The future audience had always been present. Now the event ends when it ends. This is the day Hale realizes that explanation itself has become optional. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a quiet turning point, not the loss of the persona but the loosening of its grip. The psyche no longer leans forward trying to secure recognition in advance. It trusts its own center of gravity. The self no longer needs witnesses to feel real. Hale feels this most clearly in the pauses between actions. Those spaces used to fill with self-talk commentary shaped like reassurance or critique. Now, the pauses remain open. They are not empty. They are intact. During meals, he eats without narrating the taste. During checks, he checks without narrating competence. Even emotions, when they arise, do so without justification. Fatigue, calm, a trace of loneliness that passes through without demanding a story. This is not detachment. It is containment. He begins to sense that much of adult life is spent maintaining a kind of inner court, prosecutor, defender, audience, judge, all debating the same moments again and again. Here, in the Arctic stillness, that court has adjourned. The silence is not passive. It is authoritative. And authority, when internalized, has a peculiar effect. It removes the need to convince. One evening, Hale finds himself writing in his personal notebook, a habit he had nearly abandoned. He expects reflection, interpretation, insight. What appears instead is sparse. Observations without framing, statements without conclusions. Cold clearer tonight. Generator steady. Felt settled. No metaphor, no explanation. He closes the notebook, faintly unsettled by its bluntness. Because if experience no longer demands interpretation, then what happens to meaning? The question lingers through the long night. Hale lies awake, listening to the wind scrape the building. His mind does not rush to fill the dark. For the first time, he understands that inner silence is not the absence of thought, it is the absence of argument. Nothing inside him is trying to win. Nothing is trying to persuade. Nothing is asking permission. And with that realization comes an unexpected weight of responsibility. Because if the self no longer waits to be understood, then it must stand by what it is. Fully. Without rehearsal. Without defense. As dawn that never quite dawns presses against the station, Hale senses that this shift will not announce itself when he returns to ordinary life. There will be no moment where he can point and say, "This is where it changed." It will simply be there. Quietly resisting old habits. Quietly altering the shape of every future interaction. And somewhere in that realization, another question begins to form, one that will not let him rest. What happens when you meet the world without needing it to confirm you? The first voice comes back without warning. It arrives weeks later during a routine supply drop when the drone of aircraft engines cuts through the Arctic stillness and breaks the sky open. Hale stands outside the station, collar pulled high, watching the plane descend in a long, shallow arc. For a moment, his mind reaches outward again. I should remember this. This would be worth telling someone. The thoughts form automatically, like old machinery warming up. He notices them immediately. Not with alarm but with distance. They feel foreign now, slightly exaggerated, like wearing a coat that once fit perfectly but now hangs a little loose. The inner voice is back, but it no longer occupies the whole room. It shares space. The crew unloads crates, food, fuel, mail bundled in canvas sacks. Laughter drifts briefly across the ice. Human sound, sharp and bright against months of restraint. Hale smiles reflexively. And then something else happens. The voice that would normally step forward, organizing impressions, shaping responses, preparing a version of himself for interaction, hesitates. It waits. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment of integration pressure. The psyche tests whether the old structures are still needed in the same way. The persona attempts to reassert its function, but the center has shifted. Hale speaks when spoken to, he laughs at the right moments, he exchanges the necessary words. But beneath it, something remains untouched. When the plane lifts off again and the sky reseals itself, Hale feels a surprising sense of relief. Not because people are gone, but because the internal audience has not fully returned with them. That night he reads his mail slowly, familiar handwriting, familiar concerns. Each letter seems to assume a version of him that feels slightly outdated, more reactive, more provisional. He doesn't feel estranged. He feels ahead of himself. The silence he found here has not erased his social self, it has placed it in context. It is no longer the core, it is a function. Useful. Temporary. Put on and taken off. As his rotation nears its end, Hale becomes aware that this experience will be difficult to explain, not because it is profound, but because explanation would distort it. Language would pull it back into performance. Some things, he realizes, lose their power when they are made understandable. They are meant to be inhabited, not shared. On his final watch, the afternoon light lies flat against the snow. The radar sweeps its last familiar arc. Hale stands alone in the operations room, hands resting on the console. He does not feel sentimental. He feels aligned. He knows that when he leaves this place, the world will ask things of him. It will invite him back into rehearsal, back into justification, back into the quiet panic of being perceived. And he will participate. But he will not confuse that participation with identity. Because somewhere in the frozen hours of a northern afternoon, he stopped preparing to be understood. And in doing so, he found something steadier than explanation. A self that does not lean forward. A self that does not echo. A self that simply remains.